She sat across from him at the same dinner table they'd shared for 11 years. She passed him the bread. She laughed at his jokes. She asked how his new job was going. And she had absolutely no idea that he already knew. That he had known for 3 weeks. That he had spent those 3 weeks not spiraling, not confronting, not sending a furious text at midnight, but quietly, methodically, setting up every single domino. And tonight, at this dinner table, with the candles lit and the family all gathered, was the night he was going to let the first one fall. Welcome back to Venture and Karma, the place where we study what patience actually looks like when it's pointed at the right target. 3 stories today, all new, all real, all pulled from the corners of Reddit where people go when they finally need the world to know what they survived. These aren't simple stories. They don't have obvious villains in dark rooms doing obvious villain things. They have people who smiled warmly, spoke kindly, and calculated quietly. And they have other people who, when they discovered what was being done to them, chose not to react, but to respond. That's a different thing entirely. And by the end of this, I think you'll understand exactly why. Let's go. Story 1. My friend sent fake negative references to every job I applied for 8 months. This story was posted on r/pro-revenge by a user called Silent Reference Letter. And it is the kind of story that makes you feel 2 things simultaneously. A cold, creeping horror on behalf of the person it happened to. And then, once the turn comes, something that feels very much like the specific satisfaction of watching a very precise trap close. Let's call our storyteller Joel. Joel was 29 years old, living in a mid-sized city, working a job he described as functional but not right for me anymore. Decent pay, decent people, but the kind of professional situation that you wake up in one day and realize you've outgrown without noticing. He spent about 3 months doing quiet internal prep, updating his portfolio, refreshing his resume, reaching out to his network, getting his references in order. His references were 3 people he trusted completely. One was a former manager who had always championed his work. One was a colleague from a previous company who had become a genuine friend over the years. And one was Garrett. Garrett had been Joel's closest friend since college, 12 years of friendship by this point. They had lived together briefly in their early 20s. They were the kind of friends who helped each other move, who called each other first with big news, who knew each other's family by name. Garrett had seen Joel's career from the beginning. He understood the work. He had even helped Joel think through the portfolio updates. Joel listed Garrett as a personal and professional reference without hesitation. Of course he did. He began applying in April. By June, he had sent out 18 applications to positions he was genuinely qualified for, in several cases overqualified. He heard nothing. No first-round interviews, a few automated rejection emails, mostly silence. He tried not to read too much into it. The job market is what it is. He refined his resume. He tightened his cover letters. He got a second opinion from a career coach who told him his materials were strong. Honestly, stronger than most of what I see at this level. By September, 5 months in, he had applied to 32 positions. He had received 2 first-round phone screens, both of which led to nothing. He was starting to feel something that he described on Reddit as a specific kind of self-doubt that is very hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it, where you start to wonder if you fundamentally misunderstood your own abilities. The break in the case came from a direction he never saw coming. One of the 32 companies, a creative agency in another city, had been genuinely interested in Joel from the moment they read his application. Their hiring manager had actually flagged him as a top candidate. They'd reached out to his references. But then the hiring manager had received a phone call from one of those references, a call that gave her pause.
She described the caller as pleasant, professional, and seemingly well-intentioned, someone who expressed that they just wanted to be honest about Joel in the way that people phrase things when they want to damage without appearing to do so. The caller had said that Joel was talented but had some consistency issues, that he had a habit of taking credit for collaborative work, that there had been some concerns at his previous company about his professionalism under pressure. None of it was true, not a single word. The hiring manager, to her considerable credit, was bothered enough by the tone of the call. Something about it felt rehearsed, she said later, that she did something most hiring managers don't do. She called Joel directly to flag it. She didn't share the caller's name immediately. She just told him that one of his references had raised some concerns and asked if there was anything he wanted to address. Joel was floored. He ran through his references in his head. His former manager? No. His colleague? Absolutely not. Garrett. He didn't say it out loud first. He thanked the hiring manager for her transparency and unusual courtesy that he was, even in his confusion, grateful for, and he told her he would look into it. Then he called his former manager and his colleague. Both of them confirmed they had been contacted by this agency and given, in their words, completely positive, enthusiastic references. Joel sat with what he knew and what he suspected, and then he did something methodical. He called 12 of the 32 companies he had applied to over the past 5 months. He didn't have contacts at most of them, so he used LinkedIn, identified HR personnel, and reached out with a brief professional note that he was a recent applicant, that he'd received some feedback suggesting a reference may have had an issue, and he wanted to understand if that was a factor in their process. 6 of the 12 responded. 4 of those 6, when pressed gently, confirmed that yes, a reference had provided feedback that gave them pause. In each case, the reference was described as having called proactively, often shortly after Joel's application had shown initial promise. Not waiting to be called, calling first, every time. Joel hired a private researcher. He was careful not to say private investigator in his post, but that's effectively what this was, to look at the phone records pattern and help him document what he could about incoming and outgoing reference contacts. This cost him money he didn't easily have. He did it anyway. The picture that emerged was this. Garrett had been proactively contacting companies where Joel had applied, companies whose names he had learned through their conversations, because Joel had been sharing his job search updates with his closest friend, and voluntarily offering himself as a reference with negative information for 8 months. Joel now had a paper trail, not airtight. Phone records are not confessions, but directional, documented, and supported by the 4 HR respondents who had confirmed the pattern of proactive negative calls. Here is where I need to pause, because I want you to understand what this means for a moment. Someone who has known you for 12 years, someone who knows what your career means to you, knows the names of the companies you're applying to because you told him excitedly, knows your reference process because you discussed it openly. That person decided to use every single one of those things against you. The access of trust turned into a weapon. Joel confronted Garrett with the documentation. He described the meeting as short and calm, and Garrett's face did something complicated that he didn't want to try to interpret. There was initial denial. Then, faced with the specific names and dates Joel had assembled, a kind of deflation, a silence that confirmed more than words could. There was no tearful confession, no clear explanation of why. What came out eventually and in fragments was something about professional jealousy, about watching Joel pursue something Garrett had wanted for himself and finding it unbearable. Joel's response was to cut the contact and then do something that Garrett apparently hadn't anticipated. He informed the 4 companies that had shared information about the negative reference calls. He did this professionally, not vengefully, framing it as important information for their process integrity. 2 of those 4 companies reopened their files on him. One of them brought him in for an interview. He got the job. It was, according to his final Reddit update, better than any of the 32 he had originally applied to. Better title, better team, better fit. The universe, it turned out, had been holding the right door closed while he kept knocking on the wrong ones. And Garrett? Joel found out through mutual connections about 8 months later that Garrett had applied for a senior role at a company in their industry. The hiring manager, through a chain of professional connection, that is, coincidence or something more, happened to know Joel. When Garrett listed Joel as a former close friend and character reference, the hiring manager mentioned it casually to Joel in a conversation. Joel said simply that he and Garrett were no longer in contact, and he didn't feel he could provide a character reference. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Garrett did not get the role.
Before we move to story 2, and I say this every episode because I mean it every episode, if you've never subscribed to Venture in Karma and you're watching this right now, this is the moment I'm asking you to do it. Not because of a number, because of a reason. This channel exists to do one specific thing: to tell these stories properly. Not in 60 seconds, not reduced to a thumbnail and a title. The full version, the documentation, the patience, the quiet turning point where one decision changes everything. If that's the kind of storytelling you came here for, subscribe and hit the bell. New stories every week, and the archive is full of things that will keep you occupied for a very long time. We're building something here. I'd love you to be part of it. Now, let's talk about a restaurant, a recipe, and a competition that nobody expected to go the way it did.
Story 2. My manager won a major culinary award for my recipe. He presented it as his own. I was on the panel the following year. This one is from r/true off my chest, posted by someone going by Salt and Satisfaction. And yes, that username absolutely does the heavy lifting before the story even starts. Let's call our storyteller Rosa. Rosa had been working in hospitality for 11 years by the time this happened. Not the front of house kind, but the back of house kind, the kitchen. She had worked her way from prep cook to sous chef at a well-regarded mid-scale restaurant group in her region. The kind of place that isn't a Michelin-scarred destination, but that food people know, that has a serious reputation in its city, and that takes its craft genuinely seriously. She had a gift, not just for cooking, for concept, for understanding why a dish works at the level of flavor architecture, not just technique. She could look at an existing menu and see where the logic broke, where the seasonal opportunity was being missed, where the customer's journey from first bite to last was losing the thread. Her manager, the executive chef and operations director, let's call him Fletcher, was technically skilled and organizationally competent. He ran the kitchen well, but his creative instinct, as Rosa described it, was conservative. He defaulted to what had worked before. The menu under his leadership hadn't changed significantly in 3 years. Rosa had been quietly developing what she called a cold weather tasting menu concept. 7 courses built around preserved, fermented, and slow-developed flavors, conceptually tied to a philosophy of cooking with the season rather than against it. It was not just a list of dishes, it was a written framework with flavor logic notes, pairing rationale, wine and beverage suggestions, and a narrative structure meant to guide the diner through a specific emotional arc over the meal. She had been working on this for months. She shared it with Fletcher in a one-on-one meeting in full, with physical documentation, because she genuinely believed in it and wanted it to have a chance at becoming real. Fletcher listened carefully, asked questions, said he needed time to consider whether it aligned with the restaurant's direction, said he would get back to her. He did not get back to her. What he did instead, roughly 4 months later, was enter a regional culinary innovation competition under his own name, with the cold weather tasting menu concept as his submission. He presented it with additional refinements and his own name on the paperwork. He won. The prize was meaningful, significant local media coverage, a monetary award, and an invitation to present the concept at an industry conference in the spring. Rosa found out when a colleague sent her a link to the press release with a single question mark. She read it in the parking lot after her shift. She described the feeling as watching yourself disappear in real time. She still had the original documentation, dated, detailed, emailed to herself and to a culinary school instructor she had consulted while developing the framework. She did not immediately go to the press. She did not post about it. She consulted a hospitality industry professional she trusted, who advised her to document carefully and consider her options methodically. What Rosa did next was make a decision that at the time felt like patience and, in retrospect, was clearly something much more precisely targeted. She left the restaurant. She had been offered a role at a different establishment, a boutique tasting menu-focused restaurant that was being positioned for regional recognition, and she had been hesitating. She stopped hesitating. She also, in her transition, connected with the organizing body of the regional culinary competition, not to file a complaint, not yet, but to introduce herself and express interest in the program's development. She had a reputation. She had an instructor who knew her work. She was exactly the kind of person these organizations want to know. Over the course of the following year, Rosa became more visible in the regional culinary community. She helped develop a fermentation-forward menu at her new restaurant that received notable attention. She wrote a piece for an industry publication about the philosophy behind cold weather tasting concepts, with a publication date that now sat in the record, time-stamped. When the regional culinary competition came back around the following year, Rosa was invited to join the judging panel. She accepted. Fletcher also submitted again. She recused herself from judging his specific submission, proper procedure, no appearance of conflict. But in doing so, she notified the panel chair of the background, professionally and with documentation. The panel chair, now aware, looked more carefully at Fletcher's submission. They also, as it emerged, had received a tip from another source, someone in the industry who had heard Rosa's original version of the concept discussed in professional circles before Fletcher had ever submitted it publicly. Fletcher's submission was disqualified. The previous year's award was reviewed. A quiet process followed. Rosa did not speak publicly about it at any point. She didn't have to. The industry is small. Information moves the way it moves. People began to understand what had happened without a press release. But here is the piece of this story that Rosa ended her post with, and the piece that has stayed with me since I read it. She said that the most important thing was not the disqualification, not the public knowledge, not any of it. It was the publication date on her industry article, the fermentation piece, sitting in the record, dated, public, permanent. She wrote, "I just wanted it to exist. One piece of evidence that the thinking was mine before any of this happened. Just that. The rest figured itself out." That's the line. That's the whole story in one sentence. She didn't win by fighting. She won by existing in the record, by making sure that her thinking was somewhere that couldn't be erased. And Fletcher, presenting the work of someone else as his own, could not survive contact with a panel that had access to that record.
Here's what I keep thinking about as we move toward the third story. And this is the mid-video thought I want to leave you with. Every person we've talked about today, Joel, Rosa, and the person whose story is coming, they all did something that is harder than it sounds. They turned down the short-term relief of confrontation in exchange for the longer-term power of documentation. And I think there's something important in that trade. Because confrontation feels like it gives you something, and it does for a minute. It gives you the sensation of being heard, of having said the thing, of not having swallowed it silently. That's real, that matters. But documentation gives you leverage, and leverage in the hands of someone patient enough to use it correctly is an entirely different instrument. Drop in the comments, which approach do you think is harder, confronting someone directly or waiting and documenting? Because I have a feeling this community is split on it, and I want to know where you land. Now, story 3. And I want to set this one up carefully because the twist in this story is not what you're expecting. I've been thinking about how to frame it all week. The best I can do is say, this is a story about what happens when the person doing the manipulating accidentally gives the person they're manipulating exactly what they needed to survive. Story 3. My roommate secretly recorded my private conversations for 6 months and shared them with someone to hurt me. That recording saved my life. This was posted on r/offmychest, not the true version, just the raw one, by a user called the Backfire Effect, and the title of the post when they published it was simply, "The person who tried to destroy me accidentally documented my innocence." Let's call our storyteller Camille. Camille was 26 when she moved into a shared apartment with 2 other women in a city she had recently relocated to for work. She didn't know either of them well. The arrangement had come together through mutual acquaintances, the way these things do when you're new somewhere and you need a place quickly. The 3 of them settled into a comfortable enough coexistence, not close friends, but functional housemates, respectful mostly, civil. One of the 2 roommates, let's call her Simone, was warmer on the surface and more complicated underneath. Camille liked her initially. They had coffee together occasionally, they talked about work, about their families, about the usual things. What Camille didn't know and wouldn't know for a long time was that Simone was in a friendship group that overlapped with someone from Camille's past, someone Camille had had a serious conflict with before her move, a former close friend who had, for reasons Camille still didn't fully understand, become hostile. This former friend, let's call her Drea, had apparently been feeding Simone a version of Camille before the 2 of them had become roommates, a version that framed Camille as untrustworthy, unstable, someone to be managed and monitored rather than simply lived with. Simone, for reasons that are human, even if they're not defensible, believed it, and she decided to do something with that belief. She placed a small recording device, the kind that can be purchased cheaply online and disguised in any number of household objects, in the common area of their apartment. She recorded conversations, phone calls Camille took in the living room, interactions between Camille and friends who visited, Camille speaking with her mother on the phone, Camille talking to herself while cooking, the way everyone does, saying the private things you only say when you think the room is empty. She compiled these recordings and sent them to Drea. The intended effect was, as best Camille later understood it, to find something, anything that could be used to damage Camille's reputation in their social overlap, to prove that Drea's negative characterization of Camille was accurate, or at minimum, to make Camille feel observed and unsafe. The recordings ran for approximately 6 months, and they completely failed to accomplish any of that, because what the recordings captured in 6 months of Camille's daily private life, in phone calls with her mother and her friends and her colleagues and her own interior monologue, was a person who was kind, careful, self-aware, occasionally frustrated, sometimes sad, frequently funny, and at no point anything like the portrait Drea had painted. Camille found out about the recordings from the second roommate, who had nothing to do with Simone's scheme and who had stumbled onto the device during a cleaning session. This roommate, to her considerable credit, brought it directly to Camille. Camille's reaction, she writes, was not anger. It was something quieter and stranger. She said it felt like finding out you've been watched while you were sleeping and realizing that whoever was watching saw nothing except someone sleeping.
She contacted a lawyer. In most states, and in her state specifically, recording someone without consent in a shared private space constitutes a serious legal violation. The lawyer confirmed this immediately. But before pursuing any legal action, Camille made a specific request of her lawyer. She asked whether the recordings themselves could be obtained and whether she had any right to access them. This part took time. There was a formal process. Simone, when served with legal notice, apparently cooperated partially under advice of her own counsel, recognizing that the alternatives were worse. And so Camille listened to 6 months of her private life played back to her. She described the experience on Reddit as surreal, like being handed a mirror that could play audio. All the ordinary moments, the things you forget the minute after you say them because they're too small to remember. The calls to her mom where she talked about missing home, the nights she cooked and sang along to music, the conversations with her friends where she was honest and occasionally messy and fully human. None of it was what Drea was looking for. All of it was evidence of exactly who Camille actually was. Her lawyer built a case using the recordings as central evidence, not of anything Camille had done, but of the fact that nothing Camille had done was anything like what had been alleged. The recordings didn't just fail to damage Camille, they functioned as a comprehensive character document. 6 months of her actual life, witnessed in real time by someone who had been specifically looking for something bad and found none. The legal action against Simone was settled. I won't detail the terms because Camille didn't, and that's her right, but the settlement was meaningful, and Simone's legal jeopardy for the unauthorized recording was significant enough to make the resolution one that Camille described as appropriate. Drea, who had been the original architect of the project, who had seeded the narrative and apparently encouraged the recording, faced the consequence that Camille considered ultimately the complete. Within their shared social circle, the truth of what had happened became known, not through Camille broadcasting it, her lawyer had advised discretion, but through the natural process by which these things travel. People who had maintained a relationship with Drea based on her version of Camille made their own assessments. Several of them reached out to Camille directly. Not all of them, not most of them, but some. Camille's final lines in her post are the ones I keep returning to. She wrote, "Simone spent 6 months listening to my private life, looking for proof that I was what Drea said I was. She didn't find it. In some strange way, that 6 months of recordings is the most complete evidence of my character I will ever have. Someone who hated me was the one who made it. I couldn't have asked for a better witness." I've read a lot of Reddit posts in my time doing this channel. I've read thousands of karma stories, revenge stories, justice stories. That line is one of the most remarkable things I've come across. The person who tried to surveil her into vulnerability accidentally created the strongest possible proof of her integrity. The trap, built to catch her, could only catch the truth, and the truth was that there was nothing to catch. The universe, when it keeps receipts, keeps all of them, including the ones written by people who meant them as weapons.
3 completely different stories. A sabotaged job search, a stolen culinary concept, and a surveillance scheme that backfired with almost mathematical perfection. And yet, the same quiet truth moves through all 3 of them like a thread you start to see once you know it's there. In every case, the person doing harm had access to something they shouldn't have. Garrett had access to Joel's job search, to the company names, to the reference process, because Joel had given him that access in the context of friendship. Fletcher had access to Rose's concept because she had trusted him with it in the context of professional collaboration. Simone had access to Camille's private life because they shared physical space, and she built on that access deliberately. In every case, the person doing harm made the same fundamental calculation that having access to someone's information is the same as having power over them. And in every case, that calculation was wrong. Because information in the hands of someone patient and methodical doesn't just accumulate as damage, it accumulates as evidence. Every negative reference call Garrett made was a documented contact in a phone record. Every element of Rosa's concept that Fletcher presented was something Rosa had written down first. Every conversation Simone recorded was a conversation that Camille had had in the honest privacy of her own home, with nothing to hide. The access that was meant to be the weapon became the wound for the person swinging it. I think about this in terms of what it means to live with integrity, not just as a moral concept, but as a practical strategy. When you are living honestly, when you are who you say you are in public and private, and the spaces in between, you have nothing to fear from documentation. You have nothing to fear from scrutiny. You might have things to fear from the accusation of things, from the temporary damage of a false narrative, but you don't have to fear the light. The people in today's stories didn't win because they were perfectly strategic from the start. They won because when the light finally came, in the form of a hiring manager's cautious phone call, a judging panel's archival search, a lawyer's formal request for evidence, they were just standing there exactly as they always had been. The light confirmed what was already true. That's not a small thing. In fact, I'd argue it's the whole thing. Living in such a way that scrutiny is not your enemy is a longer game than most of us think about. But Joel, Rosa, and Camille, without coordinating, without knowing each other, in completely different circumstances, all played it. And the universe, which keeps meticulous notes, confirmed the score. Before I let you go, and thank you genuinely for staying all the way through this one, I want to make you a promise, and I want to ask you something. The promise, if you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Venture and Karma, you are joining a weekly ritual. Each week, new stories, real ones, the kind where people have come out the other side and are finally able to talk about what they went through and what happened next. We do not rush these. We do not flatten them into 2 minutes. We give them the space they deserve, because these stories are the case for something, for honesty, for patience, for the kind of slow, quiet integrity that most of the world doesn't reward loudly, but that the universe rewards eventually. If you believe in that, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment. Tell me which story hits you hardest today and why. Tell me if you've lived a version of any of these. Tell me if you have a story you want us to cover, because many of the best things we've ever brought to this channel came from people in the comments who said, "Hey, you should hear what happened to me." That community is here. It's real, and it is, genuinely, one of the best parts of doing this. The ask, I want to know something specific this week. It's a question I've been sitting with since I read Camille's story. She said the recordings made by someone who hated her were the most complete evidence of her character she would ever have. My question for you is this: if someone you'd never met recorded 6 months of your private life, your phone calls, your conversations, your alone time thoughts, would you want to know what they found? Would it scare you, or would it settle something? Comment below. I'm genuinely curious where this community lands on that question, because I think it tells you something important about how you're actually living, and I mean that in the most compassionate way possible. This is what Venture and Karma is for, not just the satisfaction of watching accountability arrive, though, yes, that too, and we're allowed to enjoy it, but the reminder built into every one of these stories that the way you conduct yourself in private is not separate from the way your story eventually gets told. It is your story. Joel's job search, documented on his own hard drive, Rosa's concept, timestamped in her email drafts, Camille's private life, accidentally preserved by the person trying to use it against her. Every single one of those things became evidence, not because someone planned it that way, because the truth, given enough time and enough pressure, tends to become undeniable. You are building your record every day, in the small things, in the honest things, in the choices you make when no one is watching, or when you assume no one is watching. Build it well. I'll see you in the next one,
And until then, take care of each other, stay honest, and remember, the universe doesn't miss much. It just writes slowly.